Hello, everyone. Hope everyone is doing well. So, um, I decided I would do a nice little Saturday stream, just to chat and to talk about stuff. So obviously, um, there have been some other stuff that's happened vis-a-vis Elon that I didn't really touch on yesterday, but I did just want to reiterate some of my points as well, um, because this goes to speak to how anti-Semitism is ingrained within this white supremacist world that many people often say, anti-Semitic things or um, and think, unwittingly, right? And um, this is just another time where I want to just say, listen to um, your friends, your comrades, coworkers, etc., that are marginalized when we say that something is not right. Like when I'm telling you something is anti-Semitic, again, um, that is to say that if I am telling you that something is anti-Semitic, I want to be heard, right? I don't want to be told, try to be sort of debated out of thinking that it is, right? Um, that's harmful, actively harmful, um, because it means that you don't actually trust people. to know when, such stuff is happening to them. But on another note, I did want to talk a little bit about how there is you say, Powerful Finger says, I love Elon's take on anti-white racism in South Africa. While he lived a life of multi-millionaire during apartheid, obviously getting solid amount of money from his dad to kickstart his business. Well, I mean, not only that, but like one of the reasons why he even came to America was so that way. Because if you look at the time he came to the United States, it's because of to not have to live in a country where apartheid is over, right? Like that's one of the main reasons. I mean, that's why so many white South Africans did move to the United States, um, and did move to other places as well. Um, so I'm not surprised, right? But this comes as like Elon, being the arch capitalist that he um, is it like can say all parts out loud, right? That's the difference. Is that the people that would try to be edgy, quote unquote, or the people that would try to hide behind words or turns of phrase, or would could try to logic it out, right? And when I say that, I don't mean it actually logic it out, but to try to make it seem as though you can uh, just talk to racists, etc., and through argument convince them otherwise, which it doesn't work that way. It has never worked that way. um, and so one of these things that sort of comes to mind in relation to that, and especially for what you're saying, Powerful Finger, is that Elon, because he can say all the parts out loud, it means that, of course, um, the people that are being hurt by him, right? And people are being hurt by him, right? That's another thing too, is people are being hurt by him. Um, is that the ingrained anti-Semitism and transphobia that already exists within uh, American society, and definitely in what is often called Western societies, right? Um, is something that is still boils down to certain specific elements that I was sort of mentioning before in yesterday's stream when I was talking about Thomas Kuhne, right? That is to say that the reason why with Jewish people, with trans people, with Mexican people, um, some of the language is quite shared um, in the marginalization of the Jewish people, trans people, Mexican people, is that there is always the idea of the infiltrator, right? That is central to white supremacist thought, right? That there are people that can transcend certain borders or boundaries, in this, in some cases, real boundaries, right? That is to say, ones that are constructed up, like physically, right? Not real in the sense that like there's such a thing as a border, right? Um, and so, but then you also have ones when it comes to gender expression, right? And you also have the conditional whiteness that is attributed to some Jewish people, right? Because not every Jewish person is white. Um, and I think that's another thing to also consider, is the fact that there are BIPOC Jewish people like myself. Um, and so, in regards to this, the fact that Elon mixes together anti-trans language and anti-Semitic language is part of that idea of the infiltrator, right? That is part and parcel of what I was speaking of yesterday in regard to Thomas Kuhne, which is why the ideas of the cult of masculinity, or pardon me, the cult of motherhood and femininity, right, seeing it as being under attack The alien, yes, exactly, has always been something that, again, is always used as a justification for greater horrors down the line, right? Like the people that say, oh, well, they're just crazy, or oh, they're just memeing, or oh, now you have someone who, you know, does have um, real power, right, in a capitalist system, saying what, and it's essentially proving that when anti-Semites would talk about the ADL, it was just a stand-in for the Jewish people, right? It was, that is why people who now want to just be like, no, he really just means the organization. No, because he's made it clear that that's not what it is. And for Jewish people, we've known this for ages. But again, people who do not listen, people who do not actually speak with marginalized people, people who just ignore, who can initiate pogroms. Right, exactly. Because again, when someone who literally, right, has a platform, a platform like itself, right, like has the ability to give and remove people's platforms as well, it means that the fact of how the message came to be is also really important too, because this is where we need to discuss how is it that Elon Musk got to retweet a Nazi, right? And we know that he's been liking things. He's been liking things. He's been retweeting things, right? People focused, oh, he likes all these boomer tier memes and blah, blah, blah. It said when people ignore intersectionality in favor of vulgar Marxism. Exactly, yeah. Back in the days when they were pushed in a corner, 4chan, 8chan were nowhere nearly as powerful. Right. Um, and the way that they were able to, and the way that a lot of this was able to come about was because of something that a lot of people who I would feel should try to read, and I don't mean read just in, you know, right now you put them to the right, mainstream far right MAGA people, mixing them up. Yeah, exactly. And not only that, of course, we have to also remember that like anti-Semitism is baked into every quote unquote Western society, right? Even within all of the settler colonial states in the Americas, it's there, right? Because you have the centuries, the millennia of Catholic anti-Semitism, of Christian anti-Semitism, on top of, right, when it metastasized and became something else, something racialized, right, something tied to ideas of blood, to ideas, and then later of scientific racism, right? Um, and so that's why when you have Elon saying I bought Twitter because it turned my daughter trans, right? That should immediately speak to like those of us that actually have read and actually do want to think things through a dialectical materialist, historical materialist way, have to understand that this is where again you have the marginalization of a people, so that then the running roughshod over, right, labor can be justified through the intensifying of that marginalization. And even that's not even covering everything, right? I don't think I could cover everything. Um, but um, thinking of this, right, again, and that's one thing too, is I want us to be thinking of this together. I don't think this is something that, oh, it's just me thinking to myself, right? Rather, it's that, why is it that at the same time that Elon is saying that the ADL, right, which again, he is saying the Jewish people, or the Jews, as most people would say, caused this, right, is the fact that he is linking them to two specific aspects that have always been used by the Nazis, perhaps most notable, right? The idea of Jewish people controlling the media and Jewish people controlling finance and money in general, right? Like he is saying it, like there's no denying that that's what he's saying because that's what he said. But if we take a few steps back, right, and look at how this all started, then it shows even more so how this is saying that. And that is that at one point, there were two, and I'm speaking about two specific individuals, right? Keith Woods, who's an Irish Nazi, and Nick Fuentes, who's an American Nazi. Is that they had, for a long time, at least from what I've gathered from my own, research, I suppose, had a dispute, right? There was a dispute about how to think about certain things, right? But fundamentally, their anti-Semitism, their anti-Jewishness was always there, right? Both in, of course, everything Nick Fuentes ever says, but also in things like, again, this is where people who are not marginalized or who again live in societies where anti-Semitism is completely normalized don't make the connection right up front, right? Like when Keith Woods is talking about usury, right, a term that has been uniquely tied to the Jewish people in that is something that Jewish people have been accused of as a justification for pogroms against them, right? And that the images of Jewish people in relation to finance and in relation to money in general, right? The idea of money changers, the idea of bankers, the idea of all of this stuff or central banking, yeah, exactly, or central banking, or the Federal Reserve, or et cetera, right? It is something that has come to the fore through these two seemingly opposed parties who very recently met in person. That's to say, Keith and Nick met in person. And it was during this meeting that, again, I cannot say this. I do not have this is not a court of law, right? This is not a court of law. I can present you nothing other than me looking at times, dates, events, and trying to say, how is it that these two supposedly opposing factions of people on the right somehow were able to make this plan to have Elon start saying this stuff, right? Were able to make it happen. How is it that Nick Fuentes, the night before, says what will become the hashtag that Keith Woods will start to use on Twitter, that then Elon retweets, right? Which means that these two supposedly opposing factions have decided to put their differences beside them because now there is something that they can gain, right? That is something that leftists of all stripes should be concerned about, right? I have to admit that I was duped by Keith Woods on his YouTube channel. I thought he was a philosophy guy, and I watched a video from him about Marx and Dugin 3 to 4 years ago. I didn't know he was a neo-Nazi. Right, exactly. Because again, this goes back to the idea that he talks about, imperialism. He talks about, right, that is precisely how, right, and this is obviously the thing that comes with him being, right, sort of aligned with the Duginist Nazbol idea, right? It doesn't matter to me whether or not he says he's part of it or not. Just the evidence, right, the circumstantial and direct evidence that there is, tells us that that is the case, right? That is the thing, is now that they've played their hand, they can no longer claim plausible deniability. Of course, that does not mean that they will not try to, and that people will give them that plausible deniability, right? They will grant them that. However, as leftists, like, this is an example of like if this is beyond the pale, right? This is saying every part out loud, right? Because why even bring up a lawsuit against the ADL, right? Accusing them of anti-Semitism for one thing, which is just ridiculous. Again, I do not even agree with the ADL. Most of the Jewish people I know, including family members, do not like the ADL because they are they are a pro-Zionist organization. Yes, that is true. However, the people that hyperfixate on one institution as opposed to looking at how it is a stand-in for the Jewish people are again missing the very points of history where by focusing on something very particular like the Kreditvereinbank, right, in Austria that was owned by this Jewish person, blah blah blah, right? Suddenly they focus in on that, and somehow that becomes justification for all of the conspiracy. And to have an arch capitalist, and the reason why I like this term is because Elon has the power, right, to directly influence, right, government, right? Like it's not. He's a perfect example of what we mean when we are discussing the idea of bourgeois politics being only representing the bourgeoisie, right? Because immediately everything comes to defend him and the other capitalists, right? And this is part of, right, the right wing's usage of marginalized groups. And when I say usage of, I don't mean of using them, but rather the usage of creating manufacturing consent via hatred, by fanning the flames of hatred, to the point where now you have people who actively do things like burn books, who do actively things like, crash in the doors in bathrooms to try to genital check innocent people, regardless of, anything, right? People that want to deny people basic health care, that want to police, right? That want the militarization of the police, that want capital to run roughshod over in their minds, only the marginalized. But of course, we know from history that fascism doesn't just focus on just the marginalized. Now, it doesn't mean that the exterminationist policies won't affect mainly the marginalized. Of course, that's par for the course. But it isn't as though fascism is somehow incomprehensible now. Well, it's only in the United States where, well, I would say in most of Western countries actually, where fascism is treated as though it's and this was part of the manufacturing of, or rather, I would prefer to use Michael Parenti's quote or title of Inventing Reality, that the Nazis were somehow insane. They were maniacs. They had to be not regular people, right? As opposed to like Hannah Arendt's The Banality of Evil, right? Here, let me read chat really quickly. Mixing it up. Or central bank, yeah, which makes no sense. I have to, let's see. There's something actual very interesting when you try to figure out who is the real funder of some of these far right movements, because Nick Fuentes certainly is not an organic character. No, I mean, again, this is why the coordination of these things is something that, I mean, again, this is the problem with how the history of the Nazis in particular, and I'm going to focus on the German example, not because I think that, I think that the Italian example is, or even other examples across Europe and around the world, is kind of, stuff like that, right? I think it's unnecessary, right? Is that the factions of capital that were warring, right, between themselves, right? As I said yesterday, the finance and manufacturing capitalists who wanted free trade, and the agricultural and internal market capitalists and the petite bourgeoisie who need a closed market or who need tariffs, right, were willing to put their differences aside when fascism was able to run roughshod over the working classes, right? Like by ending the revolutionary potential of of what happened with the November Revolution and subsequent events, it was able to curtail it in completion, right? Um, he certainly started more openly being close to neo-Nazis. I saw anti-Semitic shit from him on other platforms. And again, that is exactly the point, right? Where that becomes a way of creating multiple profiles, right? It's in the same way how Nick Fuentes says, like, we don't want people to look at us and see, and then he'll start listing, like, oh, the skinheads, right? The way how they look, or the way, right? They are saying specifically, we are going to dress this way because we want people to not associate us with other people who espouse the same things, but who are unseemly to the average petit bourgeois person, right? And therein, right, answers the questions already of many things that have come since then, right? Is that um, it is not as though somehow um, the fascism that exists in the United States is um, trying to do anything but what the other examples have done, right? It's that the difference is the way in which the right wing has been given so much space to grow on so many sides, to the point where even people who consider themselves moderate are okay with the exterminationist, eliminationist rhetoric of the farthest points of the right, for example. Um, yeah, I'm again, like, I know that when it comes to Palestinians, yes, I know that again because they're Zionists, right? And that's why a lot of Jewish people don't like the ADL because they're the ones that want any criticism of Israel to be considered anti-Semitism when it's like, no, yes, it is true that some anti-Semites use criticism as Israel as a way to talk about the Jewish people, right? That is true. However, that does not mean every single instance is that. And that's the fundamental thing and that's where, like, people who consider themselves leftists, when the times when they will cross a line is typically when it comes to these issues, right? Like anti-Semitism, where because it's so ingrained in Western societies, it becomes far too easy for people to say, well, I'm just talking about Israel. Well, I'm just talking about the ADL. As if those things did not stand in for the Jewish people. As if talking about, as if there's no metonymy, right? Where something smaller can represent or synecdoche as well, right? Where a part represents the whole, right? Heard they found some lithium mines in Mexico. Look forward to the U.S. ramping. Oh, well, you know what's so funny about that, Raven? I mean, it's not really funny, but you know what I mean. Is that Mexico actually nationalized the lithium, right? Like it said, well, because our constitution says that all the land, minerals, water, etc., everything in is a patrimony of the nation, they nationalized it. So but it's interesting because when they're saying, like, where must we, what are the areas that are where we should send in, the Marines or whatever, it's like they didn't even hesitate to name that the state where they found it, right? Because it is a border state, but it's definitely, I mean, one, that's irrelevant, but two, it's because it again would enable for the imperialism of Mexico on an even grander scale than it is now to exist and to ensconce itself even more so. In fact, right now I started a Substack, um, so that way if people would like to read more of my analysis or more historical stuff that's not for stream, but that instead is more like I'm doing research and adding on to it, um, on certain topics. I've started one so then that way people could do that if they so wish. um, and the first thing that I'm writing is actually looking at the dictatorship in Mexico and its effect on the left in Mexico ever since, right? Um, so anyway, just wanted to say that. But yeah, the conspiracy theory, it was started by a guy who was doing an experiment to show how easy it is to. What is so funny about that is that like there are people who are seen as authorities. I mean, and one of these people is Jay Dyer, who is one of those like ortho bros, right? Um, that like his whole thing is, I mean, he works on Alex Jones's show, right, on InfoWars. He's one of the hosts. Um, is that like his whole thing is like, yes, there are secret meanings and everything, right? So it's like he will watch a movie, especially ones that people already have a disliking for, right? And then be like, let me tell you how this has to do with the Illuminati, right? And it's just so funny because like when you know the history of a lot of this stuff, right? Because somehow uh like the stuff that they talk about vis-a-vis the Freemasons, or what they say vis-a-vis the church or whatever, right? um uh uh that becomes like they have to focus on those things, right? Because in a way, if they had to deal with something that was real, then they would actually have to address the fact that there is, for example, systemic inequality, right? Not that there's some conspiracy that is unknown except to, these few people, right? And that is part of the casuistry that some people, right, engage in, so that then they can be seen themselves as a co-authority, right? And this is where like debate bros, etc., like the worst of the worst, right? Where they say, "Oh no," like um, it kind of reminds me of this scene in the movie Denial, which actually happened. I've mentioned it before, where the judge, Lord Justice Gray, Justice Lord Gray, pardon me, says, "What if he's an honest anti-Semite? What if he actually believes what he says?" And I'm thinking that is exactly the way in which people have been inculcated to think about things when it comes to fascism, right? That is exactly what that they must really believe it. There must be something to them which means it is, as it were, their truth, right? And it's like, no, right? He that isn't true, right? What he's saying about there being a concerted conspiracy, blah blah blah, that isn't true, right? But because people have been um uh yeah, there have been lithium discovered. I think AMLO said they're going to keep it nationalized. Yes, yes. So the question is when a neoliberal will come to power and sell that to private entities. Well, the way how the current structure of that works is I mean, this is done in other. It doesn't mean it's not imperialism, of course. Is that if they want to imperialize, I guess, or if they want to invest, right? The government has to be given a majority stake, right? So it's either they buy from the government, which is fraught with its own problems, or they themselves do start to. And I think to me it's interesting because in Spanish, when they use this word, right, which is the word exploit, explotación, right? then it means both like extraction, right? Like the extraction of minerals, but also exploitation, right? Because that's literally what exploitation does mean, right? It has become a specific type of extraction, right? A malicious one, a maleficent one, right? And that is precisely like when they say, oh, like when people are talking about, oh, the like how they're going to do that, right? It's interesting to hear that word because then it sort of makes it more clear, right, that it is exploiting, right? It is exploitation. Um, so it's like, yes, if they could exploit the mines if they wanted to, but the majority stake has to be given to the Mexican state. So, you know. But as for a neoliberal, um, I mean, that could happen as soon as next year because the Mexico's elections are next year, and two, the party of the dictatorship, the pre-party, the U.S. backed dictatorship, right? Um, they join forces with the even further right wing, right, Catholic fascist origin PAN party, right, and the PRD, to be the opposition faction, right, and the current governing coalition, which is the Green Party, the Ecological Green Party, as it's called in Mexico, um, Morena, which is the ruling party right now, and also Movimiento Ciudadano, which is a social democratic party. Um, they're like those are the two sides of that, right? And the primary, I guess, that happened recently had Claudia Sheinbaum, who was the governor, I guess is one way of thinking of it, of the state that is now or the state that is Mexico City. Mexico City is its own state, right? Kind of like how Washington D.C. could be one, but it's not given statehood. Well, Mexico City is much larger than Washington D.C. and it is given statehood. Um, and so anyway, so she was the leader, jefe del gobierno de la Ciudad de Mexico, and she is now she's now the official nominee for the presidency. Um, the thing that they did though was this really cringe ceremony though, where they're like, why don't we take sorry. They're like, why don't we take this like ancient indigenous ritual and like, and literally like, reenact it as a way to symbolize that we are, and a lot of people kind of got upset about that they took this like this like I don't want to say scepter, but there's nothing else that comes to mind at the second, that was given from Mexica leader to Mexica leader, right? And so they had one made so that then AMLO could give it to Claudia, right? But what's interesting though is that when reporting on Claudia in the United States, they will say, "Oh, she's the first woman candidate," but no report has noted that she's also Jewish, which I think says a lot on its own as well. I mean, look at the Eustacia. Sometimes it's not. Um, yeah. Sometimes it's not the actual movement, but the things behind the movement that give it power. Oh, yeah, exactly, exactly. The partisans were forming detachments 100 kilometers away from Zagreb, but I can't really think of a good materialist example outside of, say, Robert Brundo. Huh. Interesting. Oh, that's when you were both gonna say that. Um, I thought the Illuminati existed, like rich dudes having secret meetings. I mean, the thing is that the idea that such a group would have existed, like even in like the late Middle Ages or in the early modern period, which is to say like the what is often called the Renaissance, right? Kind of doesn't make sense to have continued on, like the material conditions have changed too much to where say that like this is another thing that also stands in the way of a lot of the conspiracy theorists is that the belief that somehow um the it's like the one thing that you cannot have is materialist analysis, right? um uh they um they need the idea of something being transhistorical and everlasting to exist, because they have the whole thing comes down to there are bloodlines, right? This is one of the ways that they will like people related by blood, and this is again, this goes to like the idea of like the Rothschilds, right? Even though most of them are not Jewish, even by Jewish law, because they've converted to Christianity centuries ago, some of them, they still see them as though they're Jewish, right? Because they're related to blah blah blah, whatever. Who cares, right? But they need the idea that somehow, and this is something that actually starts in the late Middle Ages, is the idea that even if you convert, right? And this was something that was sort of created the modern idea, well, led to the conditions of the modern idea of anti-Semitism, is the idea that Jewish people, because they had Jewish blood, no matter what they did, would still be influenced by that blood, right? That like their blood lineage affected them even if they would have converted, because they're still Jewish secretly, right? Or really, right? Or essentially, I guess is in the way to put it. And that comes through a lot of this as well, right? It's like the people that say, "Oh, but of course it's true," blah blah blah. It's like you're literally taking late medieval ideas on against anti-Semitism and race in general, and literally saying that it's like that racism, those ideas are still here. They're still present. Those ideas never went away, and which is because they are the same people, right? Like these right wingers are the same people that try to convince us that somehow these things are over now. And then they'll say something like this, which is like, no, even the foundations of racism and anti-Semitism as we know it now, you're literally using that logic still, right? The actual realities of wealth inequality and how few conglomerates own anything is almost mundane. So they have to make yeah, exactly. I mean that's part of it too. Yeah, for sure. I mean that's the reason why they try to make socialist movements, right? Socialist movements seem like this is where they try to be like, oh well, they were actually funded by Wall Street or whatever, right? Because then that in their minds invalidates all of the anti-bourgeois rhetoric, right? Like, oh, as soon as you say, oh well, they're actually were funded by Wall Street, which again is just a stand-in for Jewish people, um, then 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 somehow that discounts or completely effaces, right, all of the knowledge of Marx and Engels and Lenin and Mao, etc., 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 which doesn't even make sense. But again, this is not them actually being, you know, this is a way to not have to do materialist analysis, right? This is a way to to make it so that their ideas can become immune to the ideas of Marxism, right? And that's why there's always the anti-Marxism. I mean, it's always there, of course, because of class conflict. But the need to inculcate that even more so is to again tie it all back into these conspiracies, right? Because at the end of the day, the people who benefit from these conspiracies are the bourgeoisie, right? Like it doesn't matter to them how many marginalized people get harmed, because they can always just dispossess them and claim that capital. And that's exactly what they did when they expelled the Jews from England. That's exactly what they did when they expelled the Jews from Spain, is that they said, you cannot take any property with you. Instead, you either have to sell it at a low price, right, to just sell it, or just leave it. And then that's what allowed for the crown at that time in late medieval Iberia, early modern Iberia, to become the majority landowner and centralize its power. Right? That's what the Inquisition, it's not the only thing the Inquisition was there for, but that is what the Inquisition allowed to do, was begin the ending of feudal relations, right, and the beginning of capitalist ones. And so that's where we have to, and again, as a historian, right, and looking at this through a Marxist lens in particular, once you see that, then the question is, why is this happening right now, right? Like, why are these same things being re-emphasized now? Whom does it benefit? Why, et cetera, et cetera. Like, why is it that right when we're literally having inter-imperialist war in Europe again, and also people trying to start it in Asia, in this case with China, and it doesn't matter whether it happens or not. I think people that focus too much on, whether it's going to happen or whatever, blah, blah, blah. That's not the point, right? The point is that the division of the world into different imperialist spheres of influence, and then the destruction of capital for them to reinvest it and then gain super profits, right? And so in that case, what does it mean then to focus on, to begin spinning the wheels of hate, right? The power structures actually have materialist explanations behind them, whether it's Serbia and Russia having fairly close connection, or the idea that people think the DPRK is legitimately, that the DPR is legitimately an anti-fascist state, when it's reality, it's an example of national chauvinism in a very strange form. Yeah. You want to learn Spanish, you can read Borges in Spanish. Oh, Borges is really good. Like, I really like the Library of Babel. I don't know, to me it's just, to be fair, Serbia is a periphery state trying to get its best bargain from the big powers, right? I mean, in the sense that it has a comprador bourgeoisie that, is trying to, I mean, this is the thing, right? I don't think I need to go too much in depth, right? But it's like, they want to be in whichever imperialist bloc or whichever imperialist sphere of influence gives their comprador bourgeoisie the ability to have the most access to make super profits, et cetera, et cetera. And so, like, that's why people are like, oh, how come this country is like neutral right now? Why haven't they said anything, or blah, blah, blah? It's because it's not as though imperialism is wrong, right? Like, that's the thing, is reading Lenin's book on imperialism, right? Imperialism, the high stage of capitalism. Like, even people want to be like, oh, because it actually happened that there was 80,000 bales of hay instead of 60,000, like, they think that by focusing on the minutia that was the base, which is down to what Lenin had access to write it, does not disprove the methodology by which he's talking and explaining how imperialism works, right? You can take the method and it still proves correct. And so that is, whereas if you take this Illuminati, ADL, etc., like, it doesn't make any sense, because all it is are just stand-ins, I should say, right, for other things, right, that allow for the intensification of hatred, so that way you can have something like what happened in Nazi Germany, where you had Aryanization, right, which is the taking of capital from Jewish people, right, taking their homes, their businesses, etc., right, their private property. And especially in a country like the US, where the private property literally has more rights than a human being, Um, that is another reason why the fascism here is very, very extreme, right? Um, uh, is because it takes on forms that are very postmodern in the sense that they do not need they do not need to how should I put this? They do not need to prove, right, like the idea that one day they will, you know um pull down the veil and show the truth, right? Which again is never happens, right? But the whole point is that that's one of the things that they keep saying, like, oh, once we have power, then we're gonna pull the covers off of this, and then you're finally gonna be able to see that we were right the whole time, as if that's how things work. One and two, um, it never happens, right? Like the only thing that Aryanization did was just put all of Jewish people's capital in German hands. That didn't do anything other than the fact that the Nazi economy at one point, one fifth of it was funded by this, right? By all of the stuff that they were by theft, by outright theft, right? Um, and in America, a country built on theft, right? The extractive nature of what fascism requires is why, again, because one, the genocides never ended. Um, that is why, again, this whole idea that, oh, well, what if X is true? It's that that doesn't even matter, right? Like, whereas Hitler had to say, oh, in the same way, like Hitler said, even if we are, like, even if it this is what happened when it was found out that the protocols of the Elders of Zion were discovered to be a fabrication. He said, he said, even if it's fake, it only proves the truth of blah blah blah, right? Like that's another point of fashion that also people don't really talk about, because that's not seen as central to its mechanisms, but it is, especially in, again, creating the reality that allows for the running roughshod over the working classes. The real Illuminati was just a group of carpenters. They did silly rituals and initiations. They were basically a club. The conspiracy about them running the world was started by a guy I mentioned. It was later co-opted by, oh yeah, exactly. Um, right, exactly. And so that is precisely where all of this stuff is, like, one. Another thing too is that they decontextualize things, right? Historically, that's also how that aids, because I mean that's something how history is taught today, right, by bourgeois historians, is that they will look at something like the Illuminati, and they will look at, oh, they had this, oh, why did they do these weird rituals, or why did they do this thing, excuse me. But it's kind of like, if you read Freud, right, when again people saying that he was, now people say, oh, he's obviously crazy, whatever, blah blah blah. But if you read what he was responding to, you realize that actually Freud was responding to stuff that was even more, you know, off the wall, right? And again, it's through that decontextualization that then, I mean, this is the same way how people, this is the same thing when white people will be like, well, I was born now, not in 1619, not in 1776, not in 1860, right? Like, they think that somehow that is as if white supremacy only existed in those specific instances, right? Because it benefits them to think of white supremacy as that, right? That it's something gone wrong, as opposed to it's the way how the system works as a whole. And this is something I was talking about with some friends earlier, that this is also isn't this is described in ideas of racial capitalism, is that um, white people, right? That is to say, those, again, through whiteness, etc., right, who are constructed to be white, um, they equate apathy, their ability to have apathy towards the marginalized and the racialized in particular, as the normal state of things, right? Like, that is why when other white people call them out on their racism, you get a reaction of things saying, but you're white, right? For example, like they wouldn't say that to me, but like they would say this to other people. But the reasoning why is because it's this idea that apathy, right? That the oblivious nature of that whiteness allows you to stay in, right, to the suffering of marginalized people and their continued marginalization, allows for the apathy for people that want to think of themselves as not racist, right? That's why they think that the idea of active racism is the only type of racism that there is, and that white supremacy is something that is beyond this apathy, right? Because this is why the 90s are painted as some kind of like prelapsarian, paradise, because apathy was possible for white people. Whereas it's not as though it's ever possible for BIPOC, for example. And so that is part of the way in which racial capitalism, right, tries to justify itself, also in relation to looking at the idea of like black capitalism, right, or brown capitalism, right, where it tries to do, it appeals to black exceptionalism, brown exceptionalism, right, the model minority, etc., etc. But those are always tools to marginalize people further, right? They are never liberatory. That's what proves that capitalism will never bring about liberation, because even the things that they try to do to sort of negate any calls for them to not be apathetic, to no longer be oblivious, and to recognize white supremacy, is exactly what it's exactly part of the system of marginalization. And you could read more about this in Represent and Destroy by Jody Melamed, who, again, I think does an excellent job sort of going through that. The Rothschilds has epigenetic memories of shofars and money lending or something. Yeah, exactly. It's that, and that started in Europe. Like, this is the thing when people try to say, oh, well, the anti-Semitism as it exists now in the world is because of Europeans going out and colonizing the entire world. It's not because any such people had foreknowledge of people they had no idea about. And so again, that is why this idea of, this is why they try to focus in on race science, right? This is why they like the idea of DNA tests, why they like the idea of, oh, there are Jewish genes, right? There is a way to discern this. Even though it's already been shown that those tests, like if you have a lot of Southern Polish and Western Ukrainian, like from that general area, it will make it mark you as Ashkenazi Jewish, even if you're not, right? Like, which it doesn't even matter. But the whole point is that isn't how identity is made, right? By trying to focus on these race science things, what it does is that it just gives more credence to the ideas of white supremacy, right? That there is such a thing as a pure people, which there isn't, right? There has never been in history any people that can be said of. Admixture and migration is the state of being human, right? Like, that is what humans do. So there's that. But also in another way is that, again, these ideas are born out by taking their ideas of lineage and race, in this case in Spanish, raza, right, that was never applied to human beings. This is also why people that tell you, oh, yes, this is people have always felt this way. No, because even the concept of race did not exist until this period, because even the phrase itself was not used, right? Raza initially meant in relation to horses and to commodities. Then you have its transferal onto people in the late Middle Ages. And then that's when you get the idea that someone could be pure or could be purified. And that is why the racial purity laws of Spain, of Iberia in the late 15th century and 16th century, and the racial caste system laws of Latin America during the colonial period mirror and influence the Nuremberg laws, right? Because even the Germans had to come up with the concept of the Mischlinge, right? The mixed race person, because that immediately flies in the face of the idea that people can be purely one thing or another. And again, this is why white supremacist ideas about identity being essential and epigenetic, as you said, Amruther, is precisely proven false by their own premises, right? Like, literally, the more and more they try to prove purity, the less and less and less they will find it, right? It's only by focusing on saying this group is impurity, right, and seeing them as intruders, right? The intruder, hence with Jewish people, with trans people, etc., that you get the assault on, at least in their minds, in their rhetoric, against masculinity, right? That, oh, who is the who is getting especially because transness is also seen as uniquely white. It's and this is something that is on the internet as well. You can see, because it's seen as that as well. It's like, see, there's a conspiracy against white men, right? And you can see literally all over YouTube. This is so normalized, right? Like, growing up, I never had like people like 10 years old, talking about sperm count and hairlines and like sun maxing and all that stuff. That was not an issue, right? That just did not happen. But it's been becoming more normalized and more normalized and more normalized and more normalized, to the point where every time I go onto YouTube, even if it's just on some random computer, like at work, there will be someone talking about the West's war on young men, which is completely false, right? And this is precisely where, again, this is why these are the spaces where white supremacist Nazi propaganda and this stuff overlaps. Like it's used as a way to lead people into the other one, right? As soon as you have people convinced that there is an attack, then telling them, we even know who is doing the attacking, then again, right, that's what allows for the spread of these ideas among people, right? Is that then they think that now I know how to become immune from this social contagion, right? And Jewish people in particular, and also queer people, have always been, I mean, in relation to fascism, have always been viewed through the lens of social contagion, right? And this even goes back to something as, like, when I was speaking about the Vatican yesterday, is that the idea was that because you cannot tell a Christian Italian apart and a Jewish Italian apart, you needed to create sumptuary laws, right, to mark the Jewish people, so then that way you would not have sexual relations between the two groups, because that's what they were afraid of, right? Is the idea that, what if, because someone cannot tell the difference, that means that they would have a child, right? Or that they would fall in love, or that they would blah, 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 right? It's like, think about how that works and how that relates to fascism, right? Because that's exactly the point. That's exactly everything that they try to do as well, right? That same thing with FIDE, right? Like with trans players, it's that we have to put a mark against your name, and we have the right to, whether you want us to or not, so against your will, tell hostile parties that you are trans if you want to play in women's chess, or if you want to play in any chess for that matter. So They make Jewish people look like a monolith, even though there were patriotic Jewish people who assimilated and became German and supported the war effort, and there were Jewish people who didn't support imperialist war, which isn't unique. Every ethnic group, yeah, exactly. But and again, it's also the multiplication of the amount of enemies that there are, right? It's this idea that not only are not only is of course saying, see how they were part of the anti-war movement, but also they also are in the socialists. They also are in this group. They also are in that group. And then it's doing that to then say they've infiltrated everything, right? There is no safe space for, Aryans or whatever, right? And that is precisely what has been happening. I mean, the logic of a wall of separation, right? And especially when the border is seen as a racial divide. I mean, that's the thing that, again, especially people that haven't lived in America, but also people that do live in America, sometimes don't, again, because they don't recognize the fact that Mexican is not a race, it's just a nationality, and that people can be of any race in Mexico, is that they think that this invisible line is a racial division, right? As if Anglo people that moved to Tampico, which is across the border in Tamaulipas in Mexico, as opposed to Texas, somehow would change their race, right? But that's because of the fetishization of the border, right? Of it being something that needs to be defended, militarized, that has to be kept away from intruders, right? Because there is this idea of that the border equals, right, the racial divisions of whiteness, etc. Elaborate about, oh yeah, it is, yeah. Borges and I is also, Deutsches Requiem, well, that one's really good. Right, the very premise of purity when it comes to race law. Exactly, exactly. And that is the reason why, again, when we're looking at the ideas that existed in Germany, I should say, of Rassenschande, or like those things already pre-existed. Like they did not create them on their own, right? They have a long history. But like this is why when people have done, understandings of how like the US was the basis for a lot of the laws and policies in Germany, it doesn't one thing that they also fail to kind of account for, however, is that they don't look at how other European countries' colonialism also influenced it. In this case, Spain's. Like until you have the idea of limpieza de sangre, or purity of blood, there is otherwise this again the belief that it can never be changed, right? The epigenetic aspect um, uh, is not something that is recognized across Europe as being eternal, right? And so that's part of that. Lots of things people leave out of the convos about race and racism is power. Who stands to gain the most from racism? Right, it's white people. In France, it's someone who they can easily distinguish as French, which is usually white as well, or European. That concept can exist anywhere, somewhere is racialist. Exactly. Exactly. And that's why when people want to use the rhetoric of racialization, right, to a degree where then they start to create new categories, right, of marginalization that, for example, didn't pre-exist, right? That is part and parcel of how that works as well, right? Mussolini had to invent race to add darker skinned Italians to the superior Aryan race, the Mediterranean race. Right. And oh, hi DJ, it's so nice to see you. I hope that everything's going well. I hope that your article on folklore is going well. Um so yeah, exactly. Like is that then they in order to account for the fact that there are differences between people who are quote unquote of the same race, They needed to create the Danubian races, the Alpine races, the Gallic races, the Italic race, and then obviously larger groupings, right, like Mediterranean, Slavic, Germanic, right, well, Aryan, stuff like that, right, and it's there, literally, and then the thing is, of course, is that then they have to invent history, right, like in order to make it the so that white supremacy is justified in their present, they need to go back into the past and create the idea of the Aryan invasion theory, right? Which is something we've talked about a long time ago. Is that like that only that fits a particular narrative where white people, in this case, light-skinned people, right, as they would try to equate the two back then, when this false historical theory was posited, occurred, right? That blonde hair, blue eyed people in golden chariots or whatever, right? That they invaded India and kicked out the dark skinned Dravidian race, right? Which isn't true. That's not what happened, right? We've already gone over this. But that is, again, justification for, like, that like, whether or not it's true doesn't really matter, but it forms rhetorical justification for the atrocities now. And that's precisely what the obsession of in the United States with like the founding fathers and with the European colonists, etc. And of course, just because America hasn't been around as long as Europe, this is also why, for example, in response to having someone recognize their whiteness, which I have always found, to me, this is really interesting because it shows that they do know what it means, is that then white people will then retreat to like, oh, well, I'm Polish, or I'm Russian, or I'm Swedish, right? Then they understand that it actually, yes, indeed, it is a construction, because you are trying to say that you're not part of the construction, right? Or rather that there are individual parts that cannot be taken for the whole, right? And that's what I find so funny. And again, I think if people understood how these narratives of race sort of began, and also how they've taken different shapes as time has gone on, that they would notice that when people try to do that, right? Try to be like, oh, well, I actually no, I blah blah blah. I mean, it's kind of how in America they call anything that is not Anglo, in particular, as being ethnic, right? Um, and the closer to Anglo-ness you are, that's the more white you are. But at the same time, that also means that it comes under the fundamental premise that it has to be anti-black, right? Like, black people can never be assimilated into a white supremacist society, because that is the foundation of a white supremacist society, is the creation of whiteness and blackness. Um, let's see. Also, what is going on with Nazi simping for the Roman Empire? The Roman Empire saw the Anglo-Saxons with disgust, calling them swamp people, Lamau, Nazis and Western chauvinism. Well, see, that's another thing too. That's the thing, is that and I've seen like people like on Twitter or whatever like say stuff like this, right? Where they're like, of course whiteness existed in the past, right? Like, of course it did. Like, of course the Greeks saw themselves as a bourgeois nation as they did in the 19th century. Of course they did. And it goes back to that idea of that I've talked about many times, of Engels in his book on the origin of the family, private property, and the state, right? That when people in the late 19th century would read the Jewish Bible and would hear it talking about a family, they would imagine that it was a nuclear family as existed then, as a result of industrial capitalism, as opposed to the way how families have actually worked at the time when the Canaanites, right, were a tribal society. In the same way too, it's like they need for the Romans to see themselves as that, right? Like it like in the same way how the Greeks, for example, um, or particularly Athenians, did not see the other peoples of what is now known as Europe, right, as being their equal, where they saw Persia and Egypt as, and in fact, this is why so many Greek people did live in places like Egypt and did try to have like syncretic religion, right, where they would take Greek ideas and Egyptian ideas and sort of like have them become one, at least for the Greek people, right? Um, and that is because I mean, of course, that's its own conversation. That's a whole long conversation. But the fact of the matter is that they need the Greeks to have always existed, because if they don't, then that means that for example, even something as simple as like the Spartans didn't actually exist as people think of them. Like they actually failed to live up to the stories told about them. This was a problem. It's like, oh, they're over here saying that, we only need 5 Spartans to defeat the entire Persian army, and now they're like, okay, well then just send 5 of you to decide the fate of Laconia, right? And it's like, actually no, right? Like actually, same thing with like Tacitus and his Germania, right? It's like he wrote a book, never having gone to see the Germanic tribes, but people even now act as though what he said is historical truth, right? Which it isn't. He never went to Germania. He never left the central region of Italy around Rome. And we know this just from his own writings, like his diary, etc., things that he's letters, etc. And also, again, during the period that he's writing Germania, he has a position working in Rome. So again, we know that he never went to Germania, never actually met any of those tribes. He was just inventing them in his head. And yet, the Third Reich, right, in the Reichskanzlei, they had quotes from Tacitus's Germania, all on these big signs all over the place, and they were saying, see, look, this is our actual history, even though it was all fiction. But that is part of how that works. Like, this is the reason why, yeah, the Spartans were gay as hell. Mm-hmm. I mean, again, like, that is what happens when you take the idea of nationhood. And what's interesting, Raven, is Keith Woods argues exactly what I'm saying people do, right? Because some people might say, oh, some rando might do this. Keith Woods, the guy that got retweeted by Elon Musk, he has done a video saying that that nationalism has always existed, even back in the classical, in ancient times, which does not make sense. But that goes back to that point, right? It's like, then explain something like that, right? Like during the Peloponnesian War, right? Um, or, but at the end, it's for them. Again, this goes back to my point earlier. It doesn't matter whether it's true or not, right? Because the whole point is that so long as it presents itself as a narrative that creates continuity of whiteness, right? Like the idea that whiteness you can't have nationalism without decent centralization. I mean, exactly. Another thing too is they act because again, like Laconians and Athenians didn't see themselves as equals, right? Neither did Corinthians, neither did Galatians, neither did Ionians, neither did none of them, right? The fact that they happen to have spoken different dialects of the same in the same language family doesn't mean, like, that's another thing too, is like they look at the fact that there's more documents in Athenian Greek, so to speak, that therefore that must have been the language of everyone. It's like, no, it's like it's just that we know most about specific Greek city states than other ones, right? Um, and again, the most powerful, um, the Macedonians were also killing the other Hellenic groups and were going together when it is conquered, right? Because the idea of race didn't exist. Like there was like they tried to conflate the idea of like, well, again, this also goes back to the idea of like what I was saying with Engels, right? That they take the idea of family now, right, as being something tied together by genetics, by blood, right? Which only goes back to the 15th century in the first place, to then meaning that they have an epigenetic and essential connection to people groups that didn't even see themselves as Europeans, for that matter, um, and instead, found themselves, I mean, regard it doesn't really matter what they identified with or where they identified with. It's that the white supremacists now begin to reify the idea of, and I mentioned this yesterday with Daré's book, right? A new nobility of blood and soil, right? Like this is why they begin to reify both things, right? The Spanish were the first to do this, where, and I mentioned this yesterday, right? If you were a criollo, that means if you were born in Mexico, like back when it was still a colony, you could become a bishop, but you couldn't become the archbishop, right? Which is the highest position, right? If you were born in Mexico, you could become an advisor to the viceroy, but you could not be the viceroy. Only people born in Spain could do that, right? And that also, right, flies in the face of more contemporary ideas of whiteness, where whiteness exists regardless of place, right? But then it also does have something to play, right? And that goes back to the idea of the border, right? Where the U.S. Mexico border does affect something, right? Because the idea of recognizing that there are white people outside of the in this case in Latin America, would then remove the idea, or at least challenge the idea, that Latin American people are all one group and it's a non-white group, right? And that's the reason why it's like, as frustrating as it might be for many people, including myself, they want to always label Latin American people, regardless of wherever they're from, as if they're exactly the same, right? And this is something like someone like Isabel Allende, who is a Chilean writer. She said that like when she arrived to the United States, they asked her what race she was, and she actually says that she opened up her like jacket to show her like chest. I mean, not like everything, but saying like, well, what color am I, right? Which is cringe on one level, but also, I mean, again, it goes to like, they will look at someone who's white, but because, oh, well, you were born in Mexico, that means now you are, you know. I imagine a lot of that historical knowledge in other languages and cultures were destroyed during the burning of the Library of Alexandria, which you could argue are for the same ideas of purity and nationalism that we're talking about. Well, we'll see, that is an interesting point because, um, I mean, the idea that it was done in one instance with the library at Alexandria, again, this is just from my own understanding, is that it did not happen all at once. I mean, that's why the Serapeum, uh, you know, post existed it, right? Um, for a while. That parts of it were like I think isn't it like the idea like Julius Caesar or something, right? That like he set it on fire or something. Um, uh, which again, I mean, I could see why people would try to argue that, if if the idea of the library at Alexandria is tied to um, something that wouldn't be considered a, like, if it would have been identified with Egyptianness, if that even existed, right? Like that's I think to me that's kind of one of the problems is like, well, what defines an Egyptian other than the fact that they live in Egypt? Um, right. Like that would have been an interesting thing to because then you also have the idea of like a Roman citizen, right? And then a Roman, like someone from the city of Rome, aspect, right? Like, so I don't think that that would necessarily fall into that. Um, I um, has ever been a pope that is not from Europe. The only time someone from Eastern Europe was chosen was during socialist Poland to be used for the Western powers for anti-communist agitation. I mean, Bergoglio, like the current Pope Francis, he's Italian. I mean, like his, I think his parents or his grandparents were like, were the first generation that arrived in Argentina. And again, most of Argentina is white. Like in the definition of whiteness that doesn't believe, that takes into account the fact that most people have some other race, you know, admixture. It and Uruguay are the whitest countries on the planet. But don't tell that to Americans and Canadians because Um, but the point being that like the main reason, like there has never been an indigenous pope. There has never been a black pope. Like when people talk about, oh well, what about this one who was born in Africa? Again, that's because they're equating blackness, what that they're equating blackness with the continent of Africa, right? And that is again part of that reduction, right? The flattening of identity by the creation of blackness that occurs, where suddenly this immense continent, right, this huge continent here, right, is seen as being someone from who is an indigenous person from here is the same as an indigenous person from here or from here or from here, and there's no connection. Um, During the big genocide that Rafael Trujillo did against Haitians, the way they test. Oh yeah, I talked about this. Yeah, I talked about this yesterday. Uh, yeah, was how they said the word parsley because even though they spoke the same language, well, they don't speak the same language, right? Is that like, or rather, if they had learned Spanish, right, that because they lived in a country that spoke French, they would never they could not pronounce it in the way how someone whose native language was Spanish, right? So it was a way to, and it's funny too because the rationale behind the whole test for parsley, for making them say perejil, right, is the idea that, and this is again part of this idea of ethnogenesis that happens is that um, on the Dominican side of Hispaniola, um, which was colonized by the Spanish, the people there, even though most people there are of African ancestry, they have never identified actively with that ancestry, right? They've always identified themselves, right? And again, when I say this, these broad strokes, it's to sort of explicate a little bit the nationalist mentality of Trujillo, for example, where where they still, to this day in the Dominican Republic, most people identify with their Spanish heritage, right? I mean, the island is literally called the Spanish, in the feminine, the Spanish woman, right? Etc. But the point being that because that half had a different, because of material conditions, had different relationship with its colonial power as opposed to Haiti being France's main sugar colony, but also being so brutal that that because it's on the leeward side, yeah, because it's on the leeward side of the island. It was able to grow sugar cane, and so because of that, whereas the windward side, the of the Dominican, where the Dominican Republic is, it's drier. It's too arid to grow like that on that scale. So they had to replace the African slaves because of the high turnover, right? Like literally mass death, right? Like so much so that 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 meant that the peoples that were brought to Haiti were able to keep more African things, right? More links to their African culture because they were more recently brought over, whereas the ones in the Dominican Republic were there for had already been there for generations and generations and generations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Which is why to this day, even though both of them have nominally very Catholic populations, only on the Haitian side do all of the African centric, like the African based and African descended centric religions, right? The syncretic ones exist, right? Where they don't exist on the Dominican side. So anyway, so the point is that the people looked the same, right? And this goes back to that idea of when the Pope had to pass sumptuary laws, right? Because people couldn't tell the difference between a Jewish person and a Catholic person, right? Is that the way how they told whether or not was because if you're raised, uh, exactly, which goes to show how silly this distinguishes exactly, right? It's like people do all of this to make this distinction, but then you have to create these tests that it's like something as contingent as language, right? Like, oh, well, because you lived your first 5 years in Haiti, that means that, it's very difficult for you to pronounce things with a rhotic R, as in Spanish. So they would have people say the word perejil in Spanish, but if you were from Haiti and you spoke French or Creole, you would say it perejil or perejil, right? Like you can't say it, right? Like you cannot say it quote unquote correctly. And that is literally how they decided, based on the pronunciation of one word. One word. And parsley, hence the parsley, as Raven said, the parsley massacre. Because they couldn't tell people apart otherwise. So they had to create a test that allowed people to discriminate in the literal sense, right? Like, or rather in the, because to discriminate means to separate, anyway. Um, uh, was Uruguay invented? Well, I mean, it used to be part of Brazil. Like at one point, it was like the furthest south of part of Brazil, and then it declared independence. And I don't know, it's just really strange. It's really interesting because it has a language called Portuñol, which is like a mixture between Brazilian Portuguese and like Argentine Spanish or Rio Platense Spanish, right? And so it's like it's very interesting because like Brazilian Portuguese, in my judgment, sounds like it's very related. Like you can tell that there was a large immigration wave from Europe that went to Brazil, right? Because if you hear Portuguese as spoken in Portugal, it's very different in terms of like pronouncing soft T's, right? Like um, uh, veramente, right? You say that, but which means truly, but in the Portuguese of Portugal, say veramente, right? Veramente, which is more like it would sound, say, in Spanish, right? Because you have the TEs and the TIs becoming che and chi, respectively, etc., etc., etc. And then the R becomes the H sound, right? That's why when you say .br, right, for .Brazil, right? It's punto BR, right? Because it's a respirated instead of a rhotic R. I love how Uruguay pronounces the yeah. Well, I mean, because that's also how well, see, it's interesting about Uruguay too because it has more uniformity because I mean, one thing because it only has like 3 million people, 1.5 of whom live in one city. So there's more, uniformity in terms of language. But because it is very related to Porteño, the Spanish, right? And because of that, it doesn't have the ja sound, like kind of like what you're talking about, that you find more with criollos in the interior of Argentina, where the Hispanic or Spanish um, heritage is the predominant one, as opposed to in Argentina where it's not the predominant one. Italian is the predominant one. So yeah, so you say ellos quieren comer una cosa, y yo quiero comer un pan, like blah blah blah, right? But in Mexico you say yo quiero, and the farther north in Mexico you are, um, the less of a j sound. Like it's this symbol. No, it's the little J one. Um, it's that symbol where you say like proyecto, right, in Mexico City, but in like Tijuana you say proyecto. It just becomes a Y. Um, so yeah. Indonesia is 1/10 of the area of Latin America, and they're like a wait here. Let me put the purely silly to equate someone from Ecuador from someone from Uruguay. Oh, I agree. I agree with you completely. But again, that is part of like when I was talking about New Mexico, right? Like yesterday, the reason why they didn't give New Mexico statehood, even though they had a majority white population, was because they were not Anglo white, and because there was the suspicion that they were, as they would have called them back then, mongrel, right? Like that was a term used to describe, and it still is used to describe mixed race children. Um, and obviously it's racist to say it, but that is how. Well, actually, if I do get into this, I guess I can explain. I can actually go in depth if that's okay with you all. Um, this is actually the time period in the 1880s going on towards like the wait, how now to what? Um, I'll wait for Raven to reply. I apologize if I said something incorrectly or said something without due care. I apologize. Um, but in New Mexico, it's during this time that there begins the genesis of the idea of an Hispano, right? And what an Hispano is someone from New Mexico who claims that they are not. Um, I'm still I'm waiting for your like response to what you're saying hell not to, because now I'm like, oh my gosh, did I say something like incorrectly or yeah, says my message isn't posted due to conflicts. I was just saying that calling someone that word you just said is getting hit. Yeah, right, exactly. If anybody said it, but you would be surprised. Like this is something that I've researched this particular aspect because it's really the only time it's ever happened in US history where, well, I can't say the only time, but I mean, again, this is the language they used against us, right? Like this is the language that they still use against us to this day. Like anyway, right? It's meant to berate us, or rather to make it clear that we are not pure, right? Like that's the thing, right? Like that's what it's trying to say, is that because you are mixed, somehow that's even like in their minds is somehow, itself like this is why the idea that, well, Obama was half white. No one ever saw Obama as half white, because there's no half white, so to speak. There's only white or everything else, right, so to speak. At least in terms of white supremacy, in terms of um, whiteness. And it's always the other race, or the racialized group, that is always identified with with a person. Hence why he is to this day only seen as being black. But regardless, in northern New Mexico, if you look at like if they report like ethnic origin, which is already fraught with a whole bunch of problems, because what ethnicity means and what origin means is not very clear off of the sentence, or rather off of the like when people are asked these questions, it's not clear what they're talking about. Like like could there be an American ethnicity? Is Canadian an ethnicity? No, why not? Right? Like why is Mexican one but not Canadian, right? Anyway, I mean, of course, this goes to the central point of all this. So, this group of people in northern New Mexico saw that the issue that the Americans had after taking over, after stealing that land from Mexico, that they would not be given the reins of power, because if they were identified with Mexicans, who are always identified as being that term that I said earlier, which is to dehumanize us, right? And as being not white, that then somehow they began to create this history, right? And again, this is why this idea, and you can see why this is done in response to marginalization, right? And it's not the same as like the idea of whiteness and how it's been constructed. It's not equal to it, right? It's that this group of people, instead of saying the people in southern New Mexico, who tend to be more recently, at that time, migrated from Mexico, the northern part of New Mexico was inhabited by Spanish-descended people for a long time. But of course, there was a large rate of intermixture, because in the Spanish Empire, that was not seen as, negative, right? Yeah, we call them light-skinned, but they're still black. I'm not half white, but I'm light-skinned too. My proximity to whiteness also means I get marginalized different from someone with darker skin. But as far as the white world cares, I'm still not white, so to speak. Yeah, exactly. Like that's why, like that's why people who don't understand this following point, that like both of my parents are Mexican, but they're also Jewish. So I'm not half Jewish, if that makes sense, right? Because there's this desire to want to be like, well, you can't be one and the other at the same time, because there's something, right? But you could be that when it comes to being Polish and Jewish, or French and Jewish. But it's again, it's part of that aspect too, where, and I get that from both sides actually, where like Mexican people think, oh, you must have converted, or one of your parents must be like Ashkenazi and whatever, blah blah blah. Or on the other hand, in Jewish spaces, they're like, oh, again, you either must have converted, or right, one of your parents must be Jewish, right? And it's like, no, both of them are, but they're both also Mexican. So like, I'm not half anything, so to speak. I mean, like you know what I mean when I'm saying that, right? Like they want to think of it in that way, right? They want to create this division because in the Jewish world, then they can see me as Mexican, which is how they see me, and in the Mexican world, then they can see me as Jewish, which is again also how people see me. So it's this really strange thing. Whereas like with in terms of white people, they don't give like they just see me as Mexican. Like that's never been an issue for them, so to speak. But you know, but yeah, like I'm still not white, regardless. But when people try to like think through me being both identities, they think, ah, well, there must be, there has to be a half somewhere, and it's like, no, it's not actually a, but you know, it doesn't really matter, so to speak, right? Because yeah, it just shows how ridiculous this is, right? And I actually can actually just a quick, if I may do a quick aside, Raven, right now that I'm already doing another talking about the Hispanos, is that I actually know, well, I have a friend who at one point wanted to join this Sephardic Jewish organization, right? And hi, Cisco Panch, nice to see you. Welcome in. And so he wanted to, he and his mother wanted to join this organization. However, because they were from Mexico, this is the weirdest thing too, is that the director of this organization is also from Mexico. And so he called the mother and essentially said that because they weren't from the same neighborhood in Mexico, that they weren't Jewish, right? And that they weren't going to be allowed into their special club, right? Because he made it seem like it was super important. And it's like, isn't this so, like, what are you doing? You know, it's like you have a Jewish family, right? In this case, a mother and son, who want to join your organization, have paid to join. And the first thing you do is actually you do not pass our sniff test, right? Like you're too Mexican for us, right? Which was ridiculous. I'm just like, literally, like you're not from the same neighborhood we are, and he was like yelling at his mom too. I was there that day, and I'm just like, I cannot believe that this rabbi who was the director of this thing was like yelling at his mom, being like, oh, you know, blah blah blah, like you know, none of us know you, and blah blah, you know, whatever, blah blah blah. But literally, again, because of this idea that you're either one thing or the other, or you're half, right? But seen through white supremacist eyes, right? That's the problem, right? Is that you can't actually be half in terms of how white supremacy sees BIPOC. And I mean that is what you said, right? When you're talking about light skinned and etc., right? Like there is white and not white, and so when it came to, oh well, what are we talking about? Oh, I was just talking about an experience that happened to a friend of mine, based on the fact that he is both Mexican and Jewish, because I'm also Mexican and Jewish, and people often try to read me as being like, oh, I must have converted, one, or two, I have one parent that's Jewish and coded as white, and one parent that's Mexican, which I don't. Both of my parents are Mexican, so but they're also both Jewish. So anyway, so as I was saying, so now I'm going to go back to what I was talking about a little bit just before this. So the Hispanos began to identify themselves with the conquistadors, right? And with the Spaniards who came to colonize, right? Actively set up white colonies, right, for themselves in New Mexico, right? Like it was a place where they were given land grants for settlement. And this also shows the ridiculousness of it, is that one of them, right, which is just everybody else who's not white, which is more useful to describing structural racism than you're half white, half black. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Right, exactly. Yeah, yeah, you totally get it. Exactly. And that's why, sometimes it's hard to discuss it because, like, again, with white people, as soon as you begin to show that it's like, actually, like, this is how you understand things, and it is true, because that's how people in the society are inculcated, is that it proves that the whole idea that they're, that, uh, well, I think you know where I'm going with this. So so but anyway, to the ridiculous of the Hispanos is there were people claiming to be direct descendants of like this particular guy that did that was like part of the second wave of European or Spanish colonists, right? That got land grants and could live in New Mexico by the Spanish crown. And it's funny because again, they're saying like I am a direct descendant of this dude, but he never had any kids. So there's no way for them to be direct descendants of that dude. But again, that goes back to my point that I was saying before. It doesn't matter if it's real or true because that's not the function of it. That's why when people want to go do like the DNA test, it's like that doesn't tell you anything, right? Because that like you could take all the DNA tests you want. It's not going to change structural racism. It's not going to change white supremacy, right? Like nothing, that doesn't change the way in which capitalism, with its basis in white supremacy, exists, right, and is the world system. Um, and so therefore, so anyway, going back to the Hispanos, is so then they began to identify themselves as Spanish, right? Like, oh, we're not Mexican, we're Spanish, right? And the way in which the Anglo Americans come to see them is that we still cannot give them power, right? But we can see them as a sort of like mezzanine level of whiteness, right? In that they will never be white in the Anglo sense, right? In the US idea of whiteness, but they aren't indigenous or mestizo like Mexicans are. So because of that, they were allowed to keep some positions of power for some time, but it was always a race against the clock. Like that's the thing about the history of the Hispanos is that they thought that by identifying with European identity, with whiteness, right, and saying like, oh, well, actually, we're the descendants of Spaniards, so you should see us as equals, is that didn't mean that they weren't going to take away their power, right? It also didn't mean that allowed them to become a state when technically they're majority white, but that majority was brought about by the Hispanos, who are claiming Spanish descent. That's why New Mexico and Arizona didn't become one single state of New Mexico. Instead, they split them into two because more Anglo people lived in what is now central Arizona, I don't know, northern, central, whatever, where it's not like not Tucson. Tucson was a Spanish slash Mexican settlement, so it wasn't in the southern part, but in the northern central part, right, where it's colder. Um, because they already had a Anglo majority, they let them become a state first. New Mexico had to wait until they became an Anglo white majority. And I think the time that it became a state, only one position. I was taught that Hispanic is a slur. I'm a Native American from New Mexico. Well, I'm saying, well, that term in and of itself is not. I can see why people would think of it as one. I mean, because it's a term created in 1965 as a way to again create the illusion that people from Latin America cannot be white. which is untrue. Um, so so in that sense, but the term Hispano or Novo Mexicano is the terms that the Hispanos use for themselves, because Hispano literally means Spaniard, like it means in reference to Hispania, which is the Latin name for Spain. Um, and so anyway, so because they were not allowed to have any power, and when it became a state in New Mexico, like 2 decades later, only one position of power was given to an Hispano, right? But I kid you not, the entire time, the way how they kept positioning themselves was, because the Anglos will not fully accept us, we will appeal to the like hi Fina, it's so nice to see you. How are you today? How did your I guess would you call it a date, or your outing yesterday? How did it go? Um so in essence, what ends up happening, right, is that you begin to have um uh so what ends up happening uh is that they begin to essentially affirm, right, the racial hierarchy that is being, that is put in place by American colonialism. And they say, well, we're not like Anglos. However, we are still Spaniards, and we represent this older, right, noble, medieval uh, heritage, right? And you can see the date went well. We had a lot of fun. Oh, that's good to hear. I was told that it acts as a slur to kind of erase traditional native identity from Mexico and America. I just, again, it is used for that reason too, because an indigenous person from Mexico isn't Hispanic. And not everybody who's from and I mean, again, like that's something I talk a lot about on my streams, is looking at talking about indigenous um issues when it comes to Mexico, because people forget in many ways, or just never taught, that Mexico has indigenous people that were never assimilated into the national mestizo culture. Um, I could see it, if you're not Hispanic but Latino, I could see how someone would be upset about it. Like how Taiwanese people would be very upset if you call them Chinese. Right. I mean, again, this is like, because most. I mean, again, like the thing is that, like, Hispanic and Latino in the United States is seen as interchangeable, right? But they're not, um, because Brazilians don't. At least Brazil, right? It being a historically Portuguese colony, right? They don't, like, this actually happened to someone I know, where when their little brother was graduating from high school, which happened a couple of years ago, they invited him to the Hispanic graduation ceremony. He's like, but I'm not Hispanic. I'm Brazilian. Right? Like I'm of Portuguese heritage, not of Spanish heritage, right? And it kind of goes with this whole idea that, like, it's excluding people like Haitians, right? Or other people, right? Like, again, people from Brazil who otherwise are included with a term like Latin American or Latino, for example. So yeah, again, but that is part of whiteness's desire to flatten identities, right? Like that is why it's used as a kind of, like, I mean, that's the reason why something like Mexican is applied to people whether or not they're from Mexico, right? Like, the idea of someone who crosses the southern border doesn't make them Mexican just because that's the country that's there. Doesn't, but people still call people that cross the border Mexicans, right? And so that's part of that thing too, right? Where, like, the words themselves have afterlives, right? And again, this is where something like what happened with the Hispanos is where now they identify themselves only with Spanish heritage, right? Even though many of them have indigenous heritage, right? From many of the Pueblo um, peoples, right? Who either came to live in the viviendas, as they called them back then, which were towns that had hello, Judas. It's so nice to see you. Welcome in, welcome in. Um, where they had like a mission, like a church, right? And some Spanish, white settlers, and then um, uh, members of the many Pueblo nations, among others, right, who came to settle in the valleys of New Mexico, right? And so even people that were right, in one sense like mestizo, right, instead of identifying with being mixed race, because again, that's when they, I mean, again, like that term that I was talking about earlier, right? That's how they would describe us otherwise. And so that is, and so, so even people that are, ostensibly were of mixed race, instead decided to say, well, we're only Spaniards. And to this day, they still only identify with the Spanish part of their heritage, whether or not there's any real, right, connection or whatever. It's kind of like that example I gave of the people that claim to be direct descendants of someone who never had any children. So there's no way for that to have happened, right? But you can see the justification, right, that's embedded in that, right? Like the two things that became important after, like with the Inquisition. Come on, y'all, come into the gym. um, is again, like I was saying, is isn't that Rotted Ranches emote? I got whiplash when I first started meeting Latin Americans. I thought they'd be the most anti-racist against indigenous people, but right, exactly, because again, it's still it's the whole world is white supremacist, right? And all of the states in the Americas, all of them, from top to bottom, from alert Nunavut down to Puerto Arenas in Chile, they're all settler colonial states. So the racism that it was formulated by Europeans, right? It's still there. I mean, that's the reason why colorism, that's the reason why anti-indigenous and anti-black racism are, you know, um, features that no matter what part of the continent, well, in Latin America, usually you get taught that America is a continent, right? Just one continent, not two. But anyway, it doesn't matter which one of the continents you go to, right? Um, because in all of them you had at least during the colonial period, right, a white minority, right, that was claiming all of the land regardless of whoever was there, um, and and then later on justifications based on race, etc. Because for many reasons, and again, this goes back to when I was talking about the Spanish Inquisition, um, in that two of the methods, right, that they did to try to create, that they did to bring about racialization, was particularly to create the idea of like blood lineage, right? That like blood is something that connects you mystically, magically to people in the past, so much so that having Jewish blood, in that case, back in Spain, means that you never stop behaving like a Jewish person. You never stop eating like a Jewish person. You never stop sleeping like a Jewish person. You never stop existing as a Jewish person. Like no matter if you convert, right? Um, and that was also then reinforced with this genealogical thing where suddenly now people had to prove their purity going back to time immemorial. I mean, people now know how difficult it is to find documents of people who lived more than 2 generations or 3 generations back. Imagine in time immemorial, in the late Middle Ages or the early modern period, like in the 15th and 16th centuries. Imagine, uh, and that was the way in which they were able. If you could not fulfill the, because the the Inquisition in general, because the Spanish one wasn't the only one. The initial one started in Rome, in the Papal States, and different places around Europe had them. But the Spanish and the Portuguese in particular made theirs worldwide. Like, that's what people also forget, is that wherever the Spanish Empire was or the Portuguese Empire was, were subjected to the Inquisition, right? That's why when people say, oh, that white supremacy has been a global thing since the jump, I as a historian, I mean it. Like, they had the Inquisition in India, in the Philippines, right? Et cetera, all around the world, in Brazil. In fact, that's how the Jewish people who got knocked off course and ended up becoming part of New Amsterdam, which is now New York. That's the reason. Yeah, since the jump of the New York, right? Exactly. Yeah, yeah. That's what I meant, like, of their colonization process, right? Um, and so, like, that's the reason why they were sailing away, is because the Portuguese literally said, if we defeat you in battle, we will subject all of you to the Inquisition, because the Dutch allowed Jewish people to live in their colonies, but the Portuguese had the Inquisition. So when they defeated the Dutch essentially said, we will instead put all of the Jewish people on these 2 ships and send them back, right? Like don't, don't start anything, right? Like, we'll just, I mean, even that's just, not exactly what happened. But anyway, point being that one of the ships got knocked off course and ended up in New Amsterdam. And that's how, like, that the Jewish community in New Amsterdam, what is now New York, started. Literally because of the Inquisition. The SS all have their blood types tattooed on them as identifiers of people who passed the test of, yeah, exactly, of racial purity. Lots of people who got them off from Nuremberg were because they didn't get that tattoo. Right. Yeah, I mean, again, like, there is another thing too where, like, even as recently as, I mean, within the past couple of years, and I've even seen people wearing T-shirts of this, and I'm just like, that's such a weird thing to wear a T-shirt of. But like, the people that were calling themselves purebloods because they didn't take the COVID vaccine, again, like, this is why they cannot say that is not implicit in whiteness, implicit in the logics of white supremacy, is because even the idea of something like a vaccine that, which not even all of them deal with mRNA, is that they have pure blood, and now everyone else's has become tainted, right? Let alone the conspiracy theories behind all of that, which involve Jewish people, like, oh, George Soros paid for this thing, right? Which is just, like, honestly, they couldn't have chosen a more boring billionaire, like, literally, like, what they accuse him of, or rather, what they focus on, what he did, when he shorted, the Bank of England, like, had a, like, I'm not even joking, like, has anyone ever watched the movie The Big Short, right, where it has Michael Burry, right? They praise him and literally defer to him and say, ah, yes, he is the leading financial authority, because he's a white dude. But George Soros did the exact same thing and didn't even make as much money. And they say, oh, he's evil, he's blah, blah, blah. But it's right, because it's different when a white person is doing the same thing, right? Like, it's not the same thing, even if it is, as it were, the same thing, right? And that's the reason why, like, the people that try to be like, oh, after the civil rights movement, or after this, or after that, like, now we have equality.
No, because whiteness still exists. And that means that racism still exists. Like, whiteness is not, oh, what what is the percentage of melanin that you lack, which doesn't even make sense. But I think people understand what I'm trying to get at. Instead, it's the whole system that is involved with capitalism in creating these categories, right? That especially with because of the Enlightenment and the rationalization of the ideas of speech. I mean, that's the reason why Herbert Spencer in the 19th century, who actually coined the phrase survival of the fittest. Like when I see people say that, I'm like, oh no, 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 do not start saying that. Because that's the dude that literally came up with social Darwinism. That's actually where it comes from. From a guy saying that, yeah, evolution is correct. However, it can be applied to the races of human beings. Um, and you know, I mean, I don't even have to tell people why that's bad. But yeah, since the jump of the New World, I like to think that the Rothschild paid a bunch of conspiracy kooks to focus on Soros instead of them. Just joking how it was the Rothschilds they pointed to, but then suddenly became Soros. I mean, again, like, like, um, I mean, again, it's just part of this. I mean, it's not that they have stopped talking about them. It's that they've, instead now they've foregrounded. Well, one thing, another thing too is like the Rothschilds are actually not progressive, right? And another thing too is they haven't been Jewish for many, many generations. Some of them were Jewish, a while ago, like hundreds of years ago, or at least 150 years ago, I should say. But like, I don't think any of them are really Jewish now, except for the ones that were like explicitly involved with the Zionist movement, right? Which is one guy, literally, Baron de Rothschild. Like he's the only one that, like, they act like because one, therefore all, right? But it wasn't. It was just one of them who had a noble title, Baron de Rothschild. But which is funny because that's literally the lowest rank of nobility is a baron. That is the lowest rank. So like when they try to make him be like, oh, he's infiltrated the royal houses of Europe, it's like, no, it means that like he has less power or less noble status than a count who would be in charge of a county, right? There are baronies within those. So it's like, essentially it's like the area around his house, right? So I'm like, that's what I've always found so weird. It's like they've never let Jewish people become like princes or whatever, right? Like if they were openly Jewish, and the only people that were given the lowest rank of nobility, and it was only for whatever reason, who knows why. But I mean, like the thing about Source is like, he's so boring. Like, you know what I mean? But it's because he fits into the right wing. Like, the issue is that one, Soros lives in the United States, right, and has his family living here. Another thing too is that he still is actively an investor, at least in the sense that he still has an investment portfolio, which is like, well, yeah, I mean, so does Charlie Munger, so does Warren Buffett. You know what I mean? Like, so does every other old ass billionaire. Um, uh, the reason for the Rothschilds conspiracy is a whole can of dumb worms that take two. Oh yeah, exactly right. I mean, that's the reason why I'm like they focus on this one dude who's like literally like nothing. It's like anyway, he's like but anyway, right, exactly. But the point being, again, like the reason why they choose Soros is because he does have this the Open Society Foundation, right? Which is like he doesn't. It's not like he's in control of that, nor is he even the person controlling his own investment portfolio, because that's not how investment works. Like that's not how bill like the belief that capitalists work is just laughable on its face. But two, the idea that that like they aren't just trying to get profit. So, it doesn't make sense either, because that's the whole point. Like, they're going to invest in whatever's going to make them the most money. Um, and so when they try to focus in on that stuff, it's just, again, they couldn't, like, it's not that I want them to choose someone who's more quote unquote interesting, but again, it's the idea that it doesn't have to be true, right? Is that in fact, the more untrue something is, as I said earlier, the way how Hitler talked about the protocols of the elders of Zion, is that he said, even though if it isn't true, it just proves us even right either way, right? Which is, again, the point of this, right? Like, with Elon Musk retweeting this, with Nick Fuentes and Keith Woods, right, working together to get this in front of his face, right? So then that way, once he retweets it, then suddenly that gives them legitimacy, is because he controls, one of the most known, he's one of the most known people on the planet. Plus, like, it's like if he has it so that anyone who doesn't have him blocked will see what he retweets and what he, So anyway, like, and now it's front page news, right? Because, and it rightly is front page news, because what is he doing? He's suing the ADL, which again, I do not agree with, but it's very obvious that he's not against one organization. He's retweeting and liking and all of this stuff, all anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, including stuff like, Jews are trying to subvert the United States or white people, right? Let alone the fact that this is just one culmination in relation to the one that he had earlier about South Africa, right? Which is something we already brought up in chat. That, like, he already said the that the Great Replacement / white genocide conspiracy theory is true. Like, right? Like, that was his whole point of talking about South Africa. And he specifically said the word genocide, even though it's not true. But it doesn't matter, right? Like, people like Gavin McInnes, people like Lauren Southern, etc., they keep pushing this narrative of like, why is it that the numbers of people that are white in South Africa keep going down? Because they move to white majority countries, because they don't want to live in a society where they have to be equals with BIPOC, is one. And we know this because Elon himself, that's why he left. And again, it comes back to this, to what we were talking about at the very beginning, is that people will try to say that that trying to see this as anything other than him focusing on one organization is incorrect. But it's too, like, he is proving that even that, it doesn't mean people are not going to try to make us, because that's the whole thing, like, debate pros, etc., people on the internet in general don't want to see it, and instead either tacitly agree with it, which is a problem in and of itself, or are oblivious to it, in the sense that whiteness allows them to be oblivious and therefore apathetic, right? As I talked about with Jody Melamad's work, right? That, like, they don't mind him being an anti-Semite. They don't mind him, continuing on these conspiracy theories, because it doesn't matter to whiteness, right? It doesn't matter to whiteness and the upholding of whiteness and white supremacy that is going on. And so again, that's one of those things, like, why does Keith have to try to prove that ancient Greeks have the same type of idea of nationhood as they do now, when that's just not true? It's because it's a way to justify the marginalization that is continuing on, right? And so again, the fact that there is this unholy union, so to speak, of going to being transphobic and anti-Jewish is because of that idea of infiltration, which isn't true, right? And as Raven said, like, you, like, going into the whole conspiracy about the Rothschilds or Soros doesn't make any sense. Like, it's just unnecessary. They don't actually want to be convinced, right, or logicked out of it. The whole point is they just needed to be repeated and to have a space to be passed on, right? It's literally viral in that sense, because that is how then the manufacturing of consent for the genocidal actions against any particular group of people, but the marginalized, of course, against Jewish people, against trans people, is somehow justified, right? Um, and that's why, of course, Elon does the anti-ADL stuff and then also says that he bought Twitter because it made his daughter trans, right? And fascists see how that is connected, right? Like, they want that to be connected. In their minds, right? In their rhetoric, it's connected, right? Because that's everything that has been going on since forever, right? When it comes to the origins of fascism to now, is again the idea of infiltration, the idea of the attack on masculinity. Again, remember the people that, like, the dude. I mean, even that British guy, right? The one that's like fucking pronouns, right? Like, he proves my point. he proves the point, right? That it's like, obviously it doesn't matter, but it's this idea that there is a conspiracy, right? And that it doesn't matter that people try to disprove it. In fact, trying to disprove it, as it were, engaging with them in good faith, as some people might say, is not what they want. Like, that's specifically what they will. It sure does matter to. Well, right. Which is funny because I actually asked someone if they could send me the audio file for that, because I want to make that into like a sound redemption, because it's just so good. It's like fucking pronouns, like, jeez. But I mean, it's kind of like, I saw a picture of a rally that's happening, who knows where, in Nebraska or something. I don't know. And it shows this old white dude, and he's carrying a sign, and it says "abolish gender." And it's funny because it's like, you know what I mean? Like, it's like this really weird thing where it's like, well, he's thinking of it in the fascist way. He's not thinking of it in the way how people that actually who believe in things like gender abolition, or at least in the right. So it's like so weird to see that. But again, this is why liberals are always, and this is something that too that's also with immigration policy, right? Liberals are okay with it as long as it's like, this is why they're okay with when, like, they didn't like it when Trump had the ban on specific majority Muslim countries, right? When it was specifically worded in that way, right? That, oh, this was a ban against blah blah blah, right? But as soon as you can abolish gender, right? I was all like, who is this man? And then I look at the rest of the thing. It's like, oh, he means like, yeah, he means that. He means abolish trans people. That's what he's trying to say. In Minecraft, of course. I'm just like, but again, it just goes to further prove the point. It's like the people that are saying like, oh, we have to live in a colorblind society, are explicitly the people that cannot see um, anything but. So anyway. Okay, so I'm gonna go make some dinner right now. So we're gonna raid Polly. Hope that that's okay with y'all, and I will see you guys very soon.